Well, good evening from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my delight to welcome you to this very special virtual-only edition of the forum on this Monday evening. We are commemorating our former president, Jimmy Carter, a few days before his state funeral in Washington. And we're really honored to be joined again by a friend of St. Bart's, the Reverend Dr. Randall Balmer. He's the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. He is a biographer of Jimmy Carter. His biography is entitled Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter, and was recently released in second edition, and it is available in our bookstore. Professor Balmer, thank you so much for returning to St. Bart's, and thank you. I know it's a busy time for you for shedding light on this important figure in our national life.
Thank you, Peter. Good to be with you.
So I'll hand it over to you for some introductory.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just kind of make a few remarks about Jimmy Carter. I guess I would say that if anyone has not been to southwestern Georgia, and I expect that there are many people who haven't, it's worth a visit to Plains, Georgia, and particularly going 3 miles down the road to Archery, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter spent his childhood. Archery is a very small little community. There's nothing really there other than the Jimmy Carter Farm, which is now, of course, part of the National Historic Site that commemorates him and his presidency. But Jimmy Carter grew up in very, very modest circumstances. The house didn't have plumbing or electricity until he was something like 14 years old. And he grew up there primarily with African-American playmates. And so I think his understanding of race and racial relations was forged in that childhood. He went on to Plains for school, where he went to a class with a teacher he remembered very fondly, Julia Coleman, who spent her summers at the Chautauqua Institute in Western New York, and came back with ideas about starting a book club in Plains, Georgia. One of the things she said to her students was that, who knows, maybe one of you could be president one day, and young Jimmy Carter was listening to that. He went off to study at Annapolis at the military academy, and then embarked on a career in the Navy, specializing in nuclear powered ships and destroyers and so forth. In 1953, he was called home to Plains to his father's bedside. His father was dying of cancer, and Jimmy Carter wanted to be there. And this was a transformative moment for him, because he heard many people coming in to pay their respects to a man they knew as Mr. Earl. And what he heard was that his father had made small acts of kindness and generosity to the people of Plains, Georgia, carrying their mortgages when they couldn't afford them, providing credit at the Carter store. One family, he purchased new clothes for them so that they could attend their daughter's graduation from high school and feel proud of themselves. And after his father died, Mr. Carter went back to Schenectady, New York, where he was stationed at the time. And he told Rosalind that he wanted to resign his commission in the Navy and return to Plains so that he could have the same kind of influence on the community that his father had had. Rosalind was not amused by this. She enjoyed being a Navy wife. And apparently the long car ride from Schenectady, New York to Plains, Georgia, in southwestern Georgia transpired in almost total silence between these two very strong-willed individuals. He took over his father's business, and then in 1924, on his birthday, October 1st, he got out of bed, put on his church clothes, and informed Rosalind that he was going down to the county courthouse to file to run for the Georgia State Senate. And again, he hadn't consulted Rosalind about this. And when I talked to him about it in one of our conversations, he said, I can't believe I did that. He said, I would never think of that, doing that today. But he decided to do that. And that election is a fascinating chapter as well, which I won't get into because of time. But he was elected finally to the Georgia State Senate, ran for governor in 1966, and was defeated by, of all people, Lester Maddox, a notorious segregationist. And that put Jimmy Carter into his tailspin. He has a religious conversion after that during a conversation with his sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who was a Pentecostal evangelist. And he decides to rededicate his life to Jesus and to his faith. He embarks shortly thereafter on two mission excursions, one to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, and the second to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he goes around literally knocking on doors to tell people about Jesus. And that was a very formative moment for him as well. He runs a second time for Georgia governor. He's successful in 1970. And then in his inaugural address, he memorably declared that the time for racial segregation was over. And that identified him as a so-called New South Democrat. And the press began to pay attention to him. And then, of course, he launches his unlikely candidacy for the Democratic nomination in December of 1974. Goes on to win the Democratic nomination. He's elected in 1976, but then defeated 4 years later in a bitter defeat for him. And Rosalind and Jimmy go back to Plains, Georgia, as everyone knew they would, but 4 years sooner than they had anticipated. And in one of our conversations, Mr. Carter said that had it not been for his defeat in 1980, it's very likely that he would not have embarked on many of the things that he took on as a past president through the Carter Center. He also said that one of the reasons that he decided to start the Carter Center, the idea came to him in the middle of the night, actually, was that he had been trying to comfort Rosalind so frequently, saying that, U.S., we still have a long life ahead of us. We can do good things. And he said, finally, I began to believe it myself. And that's how the Carter Center came into being. And the Carter Center, of course, a lot of people know the story, but let me just give you one statistic. One of the initiatives was to try to eliminate tropical diseases, and the Carter Center identified several of them. One of them was called the guinea worm disease. And when they began their efforts in 1986, there were 3.5 million cases of guinea worm disease, which is very painful and debilitating. And last year, 2024, there were 7 known cases of guinea worm disease. And the eradication was due overwhelmingly to the Carter Center and Mr. Carter's work. So I guess I've probably gone on long enough. I'll leave it there and be happy to entertain any questions.
Well, there's so much to talk about. I wonder if we could start with Carter as an evangelical.
Yeah.
You write in the book both about how he is an evangelical and how evangelicals become opposed to him, at least certain kinds of evangelicals. And I wonder if you can talk about his place within evangelicalism as a scholar of evangelicalism.
Sure. Well, I have a three-part definition for who is an evangelical: somebody who believes in the Bible as God's revelation to humanity. Second, somebody who believes in the centrality of a conversion or born-again experience. And third, somebody who takes it upon himself or herself to try to bring others into the faith, to evangelize. And Jimmy Carter clearly fits all three of those. His own conversion took place at roughly age 11. He was converted, born again. Then he was baptized at Plains Baptist Church in the summer of 1934. And then, as I said earlier, he has a renewal in 1967 following his bitter loss in the campaign for governor against Lester Maddox. So he's very much part of that tradition, but he's part of what I would characterize as progressive evangelicalism. That is to say, not part of the religious right, and that I think goes to the core of who Jimmy Carter is. And again, in one of my conversations, I asked him if he was comfortable with that term, the progressive evangelical, and he said he was, even though Southern Baptists notoriously have regarded the term evangelical as a Yankee term. He was happy to embrace that. So that's part of it. I would argue that his faith informed everything he did as both a person and as a politician. As president, for example, he recognized early on that if the United States was to have any meaningful relationship with third world countries, and in particular with Latin American countries, that we needed to step away from our colonialism and to, in this case, to renegotiate the Panama Canal treaties. And he did that at great personal political cost, both personal and political. His advisors, including Roosevelt, said, no, don't do it now. Wait until you have a second term, then you can concentrate on that. But he was a very stubborn man. And he said, no, this is the right thing to do, and I want to pursue it. I think his attempts to move American foreign policy away from the kind of reflexive Cold War dualism toward an emphasis on human rights was, again, very much motivated by his faith. And I think his concern for the environment. A lot of conservationists regard him as the greatest environmental president ever. And that was motivated, at least in part, by his faith. The great irony, of course, is that many of the people who had helped to elect him in 1976 turned dramatically against him 4 years later. And the standard narrative is that they did so because of moral outrage over Roe v. Wade and the abortion decision. Again, I've spent far too many years of my life researching this, and I can say without worry of contradiction that that was not the reason. Evangelicals considered abortion a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s. The issue that mobilized them, galvanized them into a political movement was the defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and segregation academies like Jerry Falwell's own segregation academy. But that was the reason that the leadership of the evangelical movement turned against Carter and helped to throw him out of office in 1980.
I was surprised reading your book about Carter's gubernatorial race and the fact that he kind of played a bit to segregationists in that campaign, even though, as you said, on Inauguration Day, he proclaimed the end of racial discrimination. And I know he regretted that play, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
He did, yeah. He told Vernon Jordan, who was head of the National Urban League, you won't like my campaign, but you will like my governorship. And this is, it's a dark mark. It's a stain on Carter's life and career that I won't deny. And he didn't deny either. He did come to regret it. But it is true that toward the end of that campaign in 1970, he played to the white supremacist vote. And he was able to, of course, win the election. And then, as we said, he declared that the time for racial segregation was over. But he did more than that. He sought prison reform because he noticed that the majority of prisoners in Georgia were people of color. He also symbolically, he hung portraits of African Americans in the State House, including Martin Luther King Jr. And that was an important symbolic move on his part. So he did, and of course, throughout the remainder of his career, he had close ties with African-American politicians, particularly Andrew Young, who became Carter's ambassador to the United Nations. So he did make good on that. And the other thing that I think is important to remember, and I think the thing that Jimmy Carter doesn't get enough credit for, is that on March 9th, 1976, Jimmy Carter, by winning the Florida Democratic primary, effectively ended the career of one of the nation's most notorious segregationists, George Wallace of Alabama. And when Carter beats Wallace in the Democratic primary in Florida on March 9th, 1976, I think that's a very important moment. And I think Carter has not been given enough credit for that.
It's remarkable, especially by the standards of our time, how outspoken Carter was about his faith. And I wonder if you can talk about that from the perspective of 2024, but even the perspective of his own time. You write in the book that people weren't that outspoken about their faith for a decade or so. And then Nixon, Watergate happened, and the moral tone of Carter became more important.
It really did. And it's important to remember, I think it's hardly a radical thing to suggest that had it not been for Richard Nixon, I don't think Jimmy Carter would have ever become president. That is to say, the nation had been so weary because Lyndon Johnson had lied about Vietnam, and Richard Nixon had lied about a lot of things, and Jimmy Carter comes from outside Washington. He's a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, a family man, clearly. And he says, I will never knowingly lie to the American people. I'm a born again Christian. And that at that time, the term was not familiar to many Americans. And he introduced that into the lexicon, not only of American politics, but American life generally. The idea of being a born again evangelical Christian. Jimmy Carter made that term recognizable to many Americans. And again, I think his faith was very important to him. A lot of people think he traded on his faith. I suppose you can make that argument, but I would offer a counter argument by saying that his faith was deeply important to him. And in fact, one of the reasons I wrote Redeemer is that I wanted to write a biography of Mr. Carter that took his faith seriously, precisely because he took it seriously. And I thought that perspective needed to be explained or explored.
I remember when you preached here a number of years ago, you mentioned the infamous Playboy interview that Carter did as part of his campaign for the presidency, in which he said that he's lusted in his heart many times. I wonder the ways in which maybe Carter's faith, or at least his sense of morality, got in his way in terms of political ambitions.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I suppose there's kind of a equilibrium there, and in many ways, he was regarded as kind of moralistic, or people feared he was moralistic, and that's one of the reasons he did the Playboy interview. Frankly, is that he was afraid that he was coming off as a goody two shoes, and he wanted to dispel that. Blew up in his face. He lost 15 percentage points in popularity after the interview appeared in Playboy. I think did it hamper him? Yeah, Jimmy Carter could be moralistic. I don't think there's any question about that. And inflexible at times when he was taking a moral stand. I don't think there's any question about that either. That said, one of the things that he took issue with me in an early draft of the introduction to the book was I had said that he had a real contentious relationship with Congress, and the inference was it was because of his being kind of unbending. And he said, no, that's actually really not true. And he cited some study that showed that he really was reasonably successful with Congress, much more than many other presidents. So yes, I suppose it could have gotten into been an impediment to him. He tried not to be political as a president, and a lot of his advisors said that the worst argument you could make if you were trying to get President Carter to take a stand one way or another, the worst argument you could make to him was to say, this will help you politically. He refused to do that. He was just kind of, that's where he could be inflexible. He thought that politics should end at the door to the Oval Office, and he sought to live by that.
I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on Carter as a private man of faith, as a churchgoer, Sunday school teacher. What was his faith like outside of public office?
I think what the term that would come to mind would be consistency. I think he was consistent in his faith. And of course, he taught Sunday school for decades, and including as president. There were 14 times as president where he went to First Baptist Church in Washington and taught a Sunday school class. Now, I don't think there are many other presidents who have taught Sunday school, certainly not recently. And so he did that, and that was part of his consistency, I think. And by the way, he prepared for those Sunday school classes. It was not a matter of simply showing up and talking. He studied beforehand. He prepared very carefully for that. And again, I had the opportunity to sit in on one of them, and it was a great experience. He would begin by asking kind of playfully, "Are there any visitors here today?" Of course, there were often dozens of visitors, and he would want to know where they were from and so forth. And then he would launch into his Sunday school lesson for that day. And again, I wouldn't say that it was theologically sophisticated, never necessarily. I listened to many of them. I'm sure I didn't listen to all of them, but I listened to many of them. But they reflect a man of faith and a man who is willing to be part of that community. And by the way, he and Rosalind, up until their later years, took their turns mowing the church lawn and helping to keep the physical plant in good condition. You might want to consider that for your parishioners too, Peter.
There's not a huge lawn here.
No lawn, I
Park
understand.
Avenue. Is it fair to say that President Carter was humble, and did he see humility as a religious virtue?
He did see humility as a religious virtue, but all politicians have egos. I don't think you can get around that. And he had an ego as well. He wasn't not an easy man to get to know. I sometimes contrast him as a political personality to Bill Clinton. They are two opposite ends of the personality spectrum. Whereas Bill Clinton, kind of feeds off of social interactions. Mr. Carter was quite guarded. I left my conversations with him thinking that the only person he truly and fully trusted was Rosalind. And he was always a bit guarded beyond that. But so humility, I don't know that humility would have been the top 10 on his virtues because, again, you have to have some at least confidence in order to run for president. Famously, just I'll throw this in there, when he told his mother, who was quite a figure in the 1976 campaign, that he was running for president, she replied, "President of what?"
So I wonder if you can, we're looking ahead to the funeral on Thursday. I guess technically speaking, the funeral has already begun, but the major service will be on Thursday in Washington. What themes should we anticipate being emphasized? What should we look for as we participate in that from afar?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly what to expect because I don't really know what the lineup is at this point. But I hope, let me put it in this way. Can I answer it in a different way? What I hope people will remember about Mr. Carter was his consistency, but also his character. And I mentioned earlier that he ran for president in 1976 with a promise, which he repeated many times on the campaign trail: "I will never knowingly lie to the American people." And I think what's remarkable is that no one has credibly accused him of reneging on that promise. That's quite remarkable when you think about that. At that time, the Washington Post did not have its fact checker department. And they had been tracking recent presidents. And let's just say that not all of his successors lived up to that standard of probity and truthfulness. And I think, again, I think that's really quite a remarkable statement. No one has credibly accused him of false or misleading statements as president, or beyond for that matter, but particularly as president. And he was willing to tell Americans some hard truths about our energy dependence, for example. He was able to talk about the importance of the environment and living in harmony with nature. He also took us to task for our rampant consumerism, which has hardly abated since his presidency. His famous so-called malaise speech, which is misnamed because he never used the term malaise in the speech. But he really took us to task as Americans for failing to live up to our promise and failing to live up to higher ideals. So he was willing to tell the truth, even though it cost him politically.
There have been all sorts of think pieces in the last few days after his death. One of them, I don't remember the publication, talked about Carter being more conservative than we remember him as, that we think of him as kind of the last liberal president for a while, but he may have been the first of a certain kind of conservative president. I don't know if you ran across that same article, but to what extent was Carter conservative?
I think he was conservative, certainly in an economic perspective, because he faced very high inflation. The whole nation faced high inflation. And he realized the only way to get that down was to raise interest rates. So, and again, this did not help him politically, but he appointed Paul Volcker, who was an inflation hawk, as head of the Federal Reserve. And he did so with the knowledge that Volcker was going to raise interest rates, really clamp down on the economy. And it hurt for a lot of Americans. And I remember it. I felt it along with everybody else. And probably not as much as some people, but more than others. And yes, it did revive the economy, but it did so after Carter had lost re-election in 1980. He was conservative also economically in that he deregulated a lot of industries, particularly in transportation, trucking, the airline industries, railroads. There are people who argue that he's actually responsible for the proliferation of craft breweries in the United States because he deregulated so many industries. And he did so, and that's a very conservative thing to do, right? At least in traditional conservative orthodoxy. But one of the reasons he did that was that he recognized that so many of the regulatory agencies in Washington were dominated by industry representatives. And he thought that was wrong, and he wanted to get away from that. So it's another example of his conservatism. I think personally he was conservative as well. The issue of sexual identity and things like that. When he was president, it was clear that he was uncomfortable with it, as were many Americans at the time, frankly. We have to acknowledge that. But Mr. Carter also came in later years to be much, much more tolerant and loving. Whereas as president, he said, well, these folks are citizens too, and there's no reason to deny them equal rights. And he was very clear about that. But it was also pretty clear that I felt a little bit uncomfortable with some of those things. So I guess he was conservative in that way. Family values. I mean, he was married for 77 years to the same woman. That's pretty conservative these days.
Mm-hmm. So those of you who are watching, we have plenty of time for your questions. You can submit your questions by typing into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. We have a few questions that have been submitted already. One of the questions is if you can speak a little more about President Carter's post-presidency period. And there's a kind of popular belief that Carter wasn't a great president, but he was the best post-president. To what extent do you share that evaluation?
One of the things that I like about being a historian is that historians come around every few years to reassess previous histories and previous accepted wisdoms. And I was also pleased that Mr. Carter lived long enough to watch some of that happen about his presidency. So, and I think my book was part of that conversation. I'm not suggesting that I drove the conversation by any stretch of the imagination, but my book was an attempt to say, hey, look, let's consider again what the presidency was like. And there was really some remarkable accomplishments. And I think a lot of that is coming out, part of the regular cycle of reconsidering how we viewed circumstances in the past. And part of it, of course, is prompted by his death. And we're beginning to see some articles now more in the popular press than in standard histories that are making those reconsiderations. In terms of his post-presidency, I don't think there's any question that he distinguished himself, far beyond any other ex-president. My favorite quote about Jimmy Carter was from James Laney, the former president of Emory University, who worked with Jimmy Carter in order to form the Carter Center and so forth. James Laney said about Jimmy Carter, he's the only president in history for whom the presidency was a stepping stone. And Mr. Carter himself didn't like that quote. He didn't care for it, but I think it captures pretty well what he did. And again, the list is remarkable. Most presidential libraries, for example, are celebratory, and that's probably understandable. But he decided that his, together with the Carter Center itself, would be an activist organization rather than merely a celebratory one. And I think that accounts for the remarkable accomplishments of the Carter Center. And the other thing is that those accomplishments will continue after his death. He made sure of that, and that's really quite a contribution, I think.
Some of the discourse in recent days about his post-presidency period have been about his relationship with his successors. And I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter was not one to mince words. and again, I think is due in part to what we talked about earlier, the kind of moralistic streak that he could have at various times. He was not happy that none of his successors sought to advance the Camp David Accords that he had hammered out between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And he thought that was a real problem. And it has been. I mean, it's, the Middle East is just, smoldering right now, in part because no one picked up on his leadership in that respect. So had he been elected to a second term, I'm confident he would have pushed that, very hard to try to bring some lasting peace and resolution to that tormented part of the world. So that would be one example of that. Yeah.
The Camp David Accords were a wonderful moment of interfaith connection, among other things, for a very religious president. And I was touched in your book to read about the prayer he had composed that was kind of acceptable to all three religious traditions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He was very conscious of the fact that the three men, Begin, of course, the Jewish leader of Israel, Sadat, a Muslim president of Egypt, and Jimmy Carter, an evangelical Christian, were representing the three monotheistic religions. And he was very aware of that, and he played on that several times in the negotiations. By the way, the negotiations themselves, Lawrence Wright has written a very good book about the Camp David negotiations. And, it was an arduous process. And various parties were prepared to give up on it several times in the course of the negotiations. But Carter just kept, in his insistent way, demanding that they come to some agreement. And finally they did.
One person wonders if you can speak more about knowing Carter personally.
Well, I can't claim that we were very good friends because, as I said, there was a distance to him. But he was always very kind and genial, The first time I met him actually was before an event at Emory University. And it was a small group, I would say a dozen people there. And what he wanted to talk about was what he called the unsurpassed joy of telling other people about Jesus. That's how important his faith was to him. But in terms of my working with him on the book, when I told the people at the Carter Center that I planned to write this biography, they said that his policy was that he didn't want to meet with authors early in the process. He wanted them to have the book pretty much drafted, and then he would be willing to meet with them. And I understand that because, every schmo would say, hey, I want to write a book about Jimmy Carter and parasailing or something. Help me figure out what I'm going to say. And so I understand that. So my interactions were not extensive. And in part, I didn't need them because he had written so much about himself and there was so many archival materials already available. So I worked in the Carter Center in the Presidential Library and the archives and so forth, and then had several conversations with Mr. Carter. But again, very congenial. Both he and Rosalind, if you look at the appendix or the afterword of Redeemer, you'll read an account of my visit with him at his Sunday school, and then going back to his home, and he gave me one of his books from Rosalind's nightstand. It was kind of a humorous an account of what happened there.
There are actually several questions about the Sunday school lessons, and if you could speak more about what those were like, and one person is particularly curious about what they were like while he was president.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I've read any transcript of any of the lessons while he was president, but I can say from listening to many of them, most of them from Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, he would simply choose a text. Not being an Episcopalian, he didn't have to worry about the lectionary. He just kind of would choose what he wanted to talk about, and he would in good expository fashion, like you and I learned in homiletics courses, right? He would, talk about the text, read the text, talk about the text, try to interpret it, and then also try to provide a kind of application for the people who were listening to his lessons. So it wasn't that different from a sermon, a Protestant sermon in that respect, although he never claimed to be a preacher and was not ordained. But it was very clear that he was familiar with the Bible, intimately familiar with the Bible. He and Rosalind used to read the Bible to one another in Spanish every night before they went to bed. So he was familiar with the text itself, but he also wanted to expand on it. Very often he would, again, this is from listening to some of the recordings, very often he would integrate it with some experience that he'd had, and he would talk about how he and Rosalind just returned from, I don't know, Malaysia or something like that, and would try to throw in kind of ordinary examples, or maybe extraordinary for an ex-president, but everyday examples in order to illustrate his point.
There are several questions about Carter's relationship to scripture, and if he had a favorite book of the Bible, favorite verse in the Bible.
That's a good question. I don't know that he did. He took the oath of office with the Bible open to the famous passage from Chronicles about healing our land. And let's remember that this was at the tail end of both Watergate and the Vietnam War. And we also need to remember that his first official act as president was to pardon Vietnam era draft resistors. He saw that as an important move in order to put Vietnam behind him and move on. So I would say that passage from Second Chronicles 7 probably was fairly important to him. But I'm not sure that he had a favorite passage that I could I could identify. I guess if I were going to look that up, I would look in one of two books. And by the way, he was very proud of his prowess as an author in his post-presidency. One is a book called Sources of Strength, which is kind of meditations on faith. And then the book that he gave me from Rosalind's nightstand, which was Jimmy Carter, I forgot the title, but Jimmy Carter going through the Bible every day of the year. And again, focusing on a particular verse or passage, and then have his reflections on that. So if I were trying to answer that question more fully, I would look to one of those two books.
One person wonders if you can speak a little more about the evolution of his mind on LGBT people.
I think he would just, like many other Americans, in the 1970s, this was it was a new thing. I mean, it wasn't a new thing, obviously, but it was just not something that many people were aware of, or they certainly were suspicious, a lot of people. And I think Carter, in part because of his religious background, I'm sure, felt uneasy with it. Didn't know how to handle it. And then while he was president, and then certainly after when he was president, he was working himself with, as all of us are, right? Working with folks and finding out that, their sexual orientation, whether they let it be known or not, and just began to feel more comfortable with it. And also he had a very capacious view and understanding of the scriptures. And he frequently made the point, not so much about LGBT issues, but on the issue of women's ordination within the Southern Baptist Convention, which of course was his denomination. He often made the point that it's possible to cherry pick certain verses of the Bible and wrench them out of context more often than not in order to justify having a very narrow, kind of crabbed view of women's roles in leadership. And I think that applied to, he came to see that as applying to the issue of LGBTQ as well. And he just became generally more tolerant. Again, I would argue informed by his faith, because he understood Jesus to be a tolerant person. Again, another quote that I will paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me. He made the point that Jesus was well aware in the first century Palestine of same-sex affinities and homosexuality. And Jesus himself said nothing about it. That's a pretty strong argument, especially coming from somebody who takes the Bible very seriously, as he did.
One person asked about Carter's views on gender equality, and I wonder if you want to say anything more about that.
There's a great story about that. When he was governor of Georgia, he was quoted somewhere, I guess in the press, as saying that this was at the time of the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. He was quoted as saying that, he didn't think that that equality was all that important to Rosalind, but he himself thought that women were equal to men. Whereupon Rosalind gathered a cadre of her friends and marched down to the State House and, in no uncertain terms, set him straight on that particular issue, that she did care very much about women's equality and so forth. And Rosalind has said, and Carter has echoed this as well, that their biggest disappointment in their time in Washington was the failure to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. And so this is something he cared deeply about. He tried to work for the passage of the ERA. And of course, he was unsuccessful in doing that.
One person watching tonight said that her father served in the state Senate in Georgia when Carter was governor, and once responded to a question about a legislative issue saying that he would pray on it. And I'm wondering if that fits with everything else you know about Carter and what that says about his approach to faith and politics.
Oh no, he's made no secret of the fact that he prayed very often, especially when he was president. He said that's when I really prayed a whole lot, and he did. Now that statement might have been dismissive. I don't know the context of that exchange, obviously, but it wouldn't surprise me that Carter responded in that way. But I think it's also important to point out that Carter was a real Baptist. That is to say, he honored the First Amendment and the separation of church and state, which is fundamentally a Baptist idea. And he, even though his faith certainly informed his policies, he was very careful not to impose that faith on others. And he recognized, even if he took a particular issue on a policy, being informed by his faith, he needed to make the case politically on other grounds rather than just saying, the Bible told me so, or Jesus says do this or do that. He was very, very careful about that. Again, his faith informed his policies, no question, and I would argue that for days if I had to. But he also honored the First Amendment and separation of church and state.
One of the defining aspects of Carter's presidency was the hostage crisis towards the end. Can you talk about what that crisis said about him as a leader and how we evaluate it all these decades later?
He was under a great deal of pressure to go in militarily and guns blazing and try to free the hostages. And he steadfastly believed that negotiation was the best way to bring them back with them unharmed. And he did, in I believe April of 1980, he did authorize covert operation trying to pull the hostages out of Iran. And that ended badly. One of the helicopters got caught in a sandstorm, and a couple of servicemen were killed in that rescue attempt. He once said that if he'd had two more helicopters on that mission, he might have been able um, to succeed, and that would have changed the course of the election. There's no question about that. But he exercised restraint. He worked tirelessly toward the end of his presidency, even after he lost election to Reagan in 1980 to bring the hostages home. And as we all know, the hostages were finally released 15 minutes after Reagan had taken the oath of office, the final snub to Jimmy Carter. There's also evidence now that has come to light that has been confirmed that the Reagan-Bush campaign struck a deal with the Iranian government not to release the hostages before the election in 1980. So, which is a clear violation of the Logan Act, but bygones, I guess we can't belabor that any longer.
One person wonders if you can speak more about Carter's relationship with Andrew Young and specifically why he was picked to be UN ambassador.
Early on in Carter's campaign for the 1976 presidency, he made overtures to Andrew Young, and they developed a very good relationship. And Andrew Young stood by Carter again throughout that campaign, and throughout his presidency, and well beyond that. And Andrew Young once made a comment about that, saying that what struck him about Mr. Carter was that Mr. Carter was always at ease in front of African Americans. Other white politicians, would cater to black politicians or try to get the African American vote, but they were always, in Young's view at least, always a bit uneasy. But Carter felt fully at home and was himself. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't grandstanding. And that made a big and deep impression on Andrew Young. And the two of them had a very, very productive political relationship that extended into the Carter presidency.
So I think we'll end with a few questions about the funeral this week. One question has to do with the fact that Carter often said that he did not appreciate pomp and tried to minimize pomp. How much do you think that will play into the funeral scenes that we'll see over the course of the next week?
Well, I expect there's probably going to be an inevitable amount of pomp in a president's funeral, and that's that's appropriate. But let's remember where his final resting place will be, and that's back in Plains, Georgia. Population, what, 600, something like that. And he and Rosalind lived out their lives in a modest home that they built back in 1961. And I've never been inside it. A lot of people have, but I've never been inside it. But I can say it's it's just a very simple, prepossessing place. So for him to choose to be buried there in Plains, I think says something about his aversion to pomp and circumstances. He didn't want the Hail to the Chief played for him when he was president. He sold the presidential lot, the Sequoia, during his presidency. And part of that was that he wanted to visibly distance himself from the so-called imperial presidency of the Nixon era. The fact that after he took the oath of office on January 20th, 1977, he and Rosalind walked down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And that was, I remember watching that. It was just kind of a thrilling moment, because he said, it said to the American people, hey, I'm just Jimmy Carter from Plains, Georgia. I'm not taking on airs. I'm not any better than anyone else. And I think he truly believed that. So we'll have some of that for the funeral, I'm sure, but probably less than with other presidential funerals.
And Carter's death and the funeral come at an interesting time for our country, where we're making a transition in administrations. We know that President Carter asked President Biden to offer the eulogy. This will be one of the last times, if not the last time, that he speaks to the nation as a sitting president. Wonder what you make of the funeral happening at this specific time in our nation's history.
Well, I don't know if Mr. Carter arranged it that way or not. He might have. I don't know. It should be dramatic, and I'll be interested to see what President Biden has to say. And I talked earlier about presidential integrity, and I hope Americans pay attention to the man we've lost, and a real giant in many ways. And that's not to say that everything he did as president was perfect. I often say that he was dealt a bad hand as president, a hand that in some ways he played badly. But there's no question he was dealt a bad hand, and yet he managed to maintain his character and his integrity, and that's not nothing. A famous quote from Walter Mondale, the final cabinet meeting of the Carter administration. This, of course, is after Carter had lost his reelection bid in 1980. And Mondale said at the end of that cabinet meeting, I'm not sure I'm going to get the quote exactly right. He said, "We told the truth, we kept the peace, and that's not nothing." And that's a pretty good summation.
How do you think Carter would have fared as a candidate in our current political?
Well, I happen to think these things go in cycles. That is to say, and again, you're probably aware of this from my book, God in the White House, where I argued that Kennedy's speech at the Rice Hotel on September 12, 1960, where he said to the voters, in effect, set aside my faith as a Roman Catholic and judge me as a candidate. That set in motion what I call the Kennedy paradigm of voter indifference to a candidate's faith. And so one way I used to test this when I talked to audience was to ask anybody in the audience to tell me Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation. And, most people suggested Baptist and so forth, and it's actually Disciples of Christ. But my point is that nobody knows, right? It just wasn't important. We didn't ask those questions during that Kennedy paradigm. Nixon comes along with the Watergate scandal, and all of a sudden, we as Americans want to know something about the moral character of our presidential candidates. And so in that context, it's no accident that Jimmy Carter emerges as the choice of the voters. But the farther we got from Watergate, I think the more or the less important that became in our appraisal of presidential candidates. So if I were to become a prognosticator, which I'm not, I'm a historian, I'm very clear about that. My guess is that 4 years from now, American voters might be looking for moral character in a presidential candidate. I think that's perhaps what they saw in Joe Biden in 2020. And I don't think they're wrong about that. My guess is that in another 4 years, the Democratic nominee who emerges might in fact be someone who can talk about morality and ethics and that sort of thing. Now, the problem with the political system as it is that we allow religion or religious affiliation to be a proxy for morality. And it's not a very good test because, as we all know, there can be non-religious people who are deeply moral, ethical people. I mean, I'm sure you could name a dozen off the top of your head, and I could too. So it's not a very good test of it. But I would be surprised if religion in some form, or morality or ethics, were not part of the conversation in the next presidential election. But again, I'm venturing into unfamiliar territory when I prognosticate rather than be a historian, which is what I am.
Well, and not to ask you to prognosticate further, but as a kind of final question, I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on Carter's legacy. He lived for a century. In another century, how are we as Americans, as global citizens, going to look back at this figure and the impact that he made?
Well, I think the assessment is going to be fairly positive, and my guess is that he'll be seen as something of an anomaly, given who we've elected since Carter's presidency. That's not to say that all of them have been bad. I don't think that's the case at all. But the fact that he spoke so unstintingly about his faith, at least for that moment or several decades at the end of the 20th century or the turn of the 21st century, will be seen as somewhat anomalous. Will we? I think there'll be a new appreciation for, in many ways, how prophetic he was. Certainly in terms of energy policy, putting solar panels on the White House, of course, which Ronald Reagan, his successor, removed. Talking about the importance of preserving the earth, talking about the importance of human rights. I hope those are things that will still be part of the conversation in 100 years, because they need to be part of the conversation. And Jimmy Carter talked about that, and that was a very important part of his presidency.
Well, Professor Balmer, thank you so much for helping us make sense of this current moment and pay tribute to this very important figure in our national life. We're grateful. I know it's a busy time for you, and you're talking to CNN and other folks, so we're just really honored that you spent time to talk to St. Bart's. Thank you so much.
St. Bart's is always a pleasure, as are you, Peter. Good to see you.
Good to see you, and thank you all for watching. We'll see you soon. Thank you so much, Randall. Really appreciate it.
Route? Okay.
Yeah.